He laughed, grabbed the scissors, and shredded my severance agreement right in front of me, then tossed the pieces into the bin, labeled confidential. I picked up a fragment, saw the word mutual. After that, nothing between us would be mutual again. 3 patents keeping the whole company alive. I knew who held the keys, and that person was drowning in debt, drowning bad. They thought I was just the girl who handled lights, water, elevators. They didn't know I was also the one who wrote that tiny footnote in Appendix C, Section 4B. When the CEO realized I'd bought the vendor licensing his 3 key patents, every single one of their digital signing servers, legally speaking, went silent. My name is Elena Hart, and until 3:45 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, I was the head of operations and contract compliance at Northbridge Dynamics. The glass conference room on the 14th floor had always been my favorite: soundproof walls, automated blinds that adjusted to the Colorado sun, and a view of the Rockies that made even budget meetings bearable. That afternoon, it became my execution chamber. Gavin Slate sat across from me, his Mont Blanc pen tapping against the mahogany table in a rhythm I'd memorized over 6 years. Tap, tap, pause, the tell that meant he'd already made up his mind about something unpleasant. To his right, Kayla Pierce from HR clutched a manila folder like a life preserver. Mason Dwyer, our outside counsel, checked his phone every 30 seconds, billing us $400 an hour for the privilege. "Elena," Gavin began, his voice carrying that manufactured warmth he'd perfected for investor calls. "You know we value everything you've done for Northbridge." Past tense. I kept my hands flat on the table, watching the light catch on the scissors next to his leather portfolio. German-made, surgical steel, the kind you'd find in an operating room, not a tech company conference room. Another one of his power props, like the vintage chess set in his office or the Tesla key fob he'd fidget with during negotiations. "The market's shifting," he continued. "Our Series D is contingent on demonstrating operational efficiency. The board's mandated a 15% headcount reduction." I'd written the board presentation myself. Slide 17 specifically recommended expanding the compliance team to handle our growing patent portfolio. Funny how my recommendations became my death warrant. Kayla slid the folder across the table. "We've prepared a severance package, 3 months' salary, continued health coverage through COBRA, and of course, your vested options remain intact." I opened the folder: standard separation agreement, mutual non-disparagement, release of claims. Paragraph 7C caught my eye: immediate forfeiture of all company property, passwords, and system access. They'd probably locked me out of the network the moment I'd walked into this room. That's why the overhead lights had flickered when I'd badged in. Maintenance, they'd said, but I knew every electrical hiccup in this building. That particular flicker meant they'd updated the access control system. "I need to review this with my attorney," I said. Gavin's pen stopped tapping. "That's unnecessary. This is generous. Elena, more than generous." Mason finally looked up from his phone. "The terms are non-negotiable and time-sensitive. The offer expires at close of business today." 6 years. 6 years of supply chain audits, vendor negotiations, and turning their mess of handshake deals into enforceable contracts. I'd built their entire compliance infrastructure from scratch, saved them from 3 different FDA warnings, and personally managed the IP licensing that kept their biosensor products legal. My signature was on every critical vendor agreement in their portfolio. "I see." I reached for the pen Kayla offered a cheap Bic, not even the courtesy of something respectable for signing away my career. That's when Gavin picked up the scissors. "Actually," he said, pulling the agreement back across the table, "I've reconsidered." The first cut was precise, straight down the middle. The second followed the first, then the third, until my 3 months of severance became confetti. He gathered the strips with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, squared them into a neat stack, and cut again, crosswise this time. The pieces fell like snow onto the conference table. "Effective immediately," he said, brushing the fragments into the wastebasket marked "Confidential Shredding Only." "Security will escort you out. Your personal items will be mailed." Kayla's face had gone pale. Even Mason looked uncomfortable, thumb hovering over his phone like he was documenting this for billable hours or protection. I stood slowly, straightening my blazer. One piece of paper had missed the bin, floating to rest near my chair. I bent to retrieve it, saw the fragment of text. Tool release and set. The word mutual, almost complete. "I'll see myself out," I said, tucking the scrap into my pocket. "Security will assist you," Gavin repeated. His pen had resumed its rhythm. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. The walk to the elevator took 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I knew because I'd timed every route in this building, calculated the wear patterns on the carpet, the replacement cycles for the LED panels, the mean time between failures for each elevation motor, details nobody noticed until they failed, details that were about to matter more than Gavin's slate could possibly imagine. Brad from security met me at my former office. He looked apologetic as he watched me pack. 1 banker's box, 1 potted succulent, 6 years reduced to what I could carry in a single trip. "I'm sorry about this, Elena," Brad mumbled. "You were always good to us." I'd fought for the security team's overtime pay, got them included in the company health plan. Brad's daughter had needed surgery last year. I'd personally walked the insurance paperwork through approvals. "It's not your fault," I said, noting the new security badge on his lanyard. "Firmware update. They'd pushed it through 2 days ago. I'd signed off on the vendor change order myself." The irony wasn't lost on me. The elevator descended in silence. 14 floors of memories. The 7th floor where I'd caught our previous CFO falsifying vendor invoices. The 10th floor where I'd spent 3 straight days reviewing contracts during our first acquisition. The basement where I'd discovered the previous facilities manager running a crypto mining operation on company power. Outside, the March air bit sharp against my face. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the building that had consumed 6 years of my life. The executive floor windows were tinted, but I knew Gavin was up there, probably already calculating how to redistribute my salary into his bonus pool. I pulled out the paper fragment from my pocket. Release and set. Mutual. Nothing about what happened in that room was mutual, but Gavin had made a mistake. He'd treated me like overhead. Forgettable infrastructure. The person who kept the lights on, the elevators running, the contracts clean. He'd forgotten that I knew where every wire led, every contract term, every carefully buried liability. Most importantly, he'd forgotten that I'd been the one to structure the licensing deals that kept Northbridge's products from becoming very expensive paperweights. My phone buzzed. Email notification. They'd already killed my company account, but my personal Gmail was lighting up. Automated alerts from our vendor monitoring systems, the ones I'd insisted remain independent of company infrastructure. Vantage Arc Licensing had just filed a UCC amendment. Heliosynth Labs was late on their patent maintenance fees. Small things. The kind of details that only mattered if you knew how to read the pattern. I started my car and drove home. That tiny scrap of paper on my dashboard. Mutual. By the time I was done, Gavin Slate would learn exactly what that word meant. The storage unit in Thornton had been my insurance policy for 3 years. Climate-controlled, biometric locks, and most importantly, completely off Northbridge's radar. I'd started keeping copies after the first time Gavin had misplaced a critical vendor contract right before an audit. Trust, but verify, or in my case, verify document, and store off-site. I keyed in the access code at 8:23 p.m. Inside, 4 filing cabinets stood like sentinels. Not the cheap Office Depot variety, these were fire-rated. GSA approved. The kind government contractors used for classified documents. Each drawer labeled in my handwriting, vendor agreements, patent licenses, compliance audits, side letters. The side letters drawer was where the real leverage lived. Those gentlemen's agreements and handshake deals that Gavin loved. Formalized just enough to be binding but never quite making it into the official contract management system. I'd insisted on documenting them all. For compliance, I'd said. Gavin had waved me off. Too busy planning his next investor dinner to care about paperwork. I pulled the Vantage Arc licensing file first. 2 inches thick, tabbed and cross-referenced. The master agreement was standard enough non-exclusive license to 3 key patents in Northbridge's biosensor portfolio. But the appendices told a different story. Appendix C. Section 4B audit rights, with a 12-month look-back and penalties for unreported revenue. Appendix E. The escrow agreement for digital signing certificates and calibration parameters. Article 14.3. Change of control provisions that Gavin had negotiated down from immediate termination to a 30-day cure period. Those 3 patents were the backbone of everything Northbridge sold. U.S. Patent 9, 847291. Method and system for microfluidic flow control in biosensing applications. U.S. Patent 9, 962108. Selective binding surface chemistry for multi-analyte detection. U.S. Patent 10, 234567. Signal processing algorithm for noise reduction in biological measurements. Without them, Northbridge's entire product line was just expensive plastic and silicon. Every unit shipped, every software update pushed, every customer deployment, all of it depended on the license staying valid. I spread the contracts across the floor, mapping the web of dependencies. Heliosynth Labs owned the patents, but had exclusively licensed them to VantageArc for sublicensing in the medical device field. VantageArc had sublicensed to 12 companies, with Northbridge consuming about 80% of the revenue stream. The whole arrangement balanced on contractual timing requirements, notice periods, and cure provisions that I'd spent 2 years negotiating. My laptop booted up, personal machine, never touched Northbridge's network. The vendor monitoring dashboards I'd built on my own time flickered to life. Public records, SEC filings, UCC searches, patent office records, all the breadcrumbs that told a story if you knew how to read them. VantageArc Licensing, LLC, Delaware entity, registered agent in Wilmington, but the real operations ran out of a small office in Aurora. I pulled their latest state filing, Board of Managers, Marcus Webb, Jennifer Okafor, David Park. I knew Marcus from industry conferences, brilliant engineer, terrible businessman. He'd founded VantageArc to commercialize Heliosynth's patents, but never quite figured out how to scale beyond being a paper-pushing middleman. The financial tells were all there. 3 mechanics' liens filed against their Aurora office in the last 6 months. A UCC-1 financing statement from Bridge Capital Partners securing all assets, including intellectual property rights and licenses. Their PACER profile showed 2 collections lawsuits, both under $20,000 but still active. The patent maintenance fees for the Heliosynth portfolio were coming due next quarter, about $400,000 they clearly didn't have. I cross-referenced the Bridge Capital loan documents with the VantageArc license agreement. Beautiful. The security interest was subordinate to existing licenses' standard carve-out language, but there was a foreclosure trigger if VantageArc missed 2 consecutive interest payments. According to the UCC continuation statement, they'd already missed 1. Side letter number 3 made it even better. Buried in the miscellaneous provisions, a right of first refusal if VantageArc ever sought additional financing or sale of substantially all assets. 48-hour notice requirement. 10 business days to match any bona fide offer. I'd insisted on that clause after watching another vendor get acquired and triple our licensing fees overnight. The sublicense revenue reports were in a separate folder. I'd maintained shadow records of every royalty payment, every quarterly true-up, every audit discrepancy. Northbridge had been playing games with the numbers, allocating biosensor revenue to software services to avoid the 7% royalty, bundling patented components with unrelated products to dilute the percentage basis. Classic Gavin Slate financial engineering. By my calculations, they'd underreported by about $12 million over 3 years. That was before penalties and interest. The audit provisions in Appendix C were draconian 200% penalty for willful underreporting, plus interest at the maximum legal rate. I photographed every page, uploaded to 3 different cloud services, encrypted the files. Then I pulled the corporate formation documents I'd prepared 2 years ago but never filed. Heartline Holdings, LLC, Named after my grandmother, she'd taught me that the best revenge was a life well lived. She'd never met Gavin Slate. The business plan wrote itself. Acquire distressed asset Vantage Arc's license portfolio. Maximize value through proper enforcement and compliance. Exit through strategic sale or long-term royalty stream. Clean, simple, devastating. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Unknown Colorado number. Ms. Hart, this is Bradley Chen from Bridge Capital. I understand you have experience with Vantage Arc licensing. Word traveled fast in Denver's tech finance community. Brad must have given someone my number. Or maybe Kayla. Feeling guilty. Didn't matter. I'm familiar with their portfolio, I said carefully. We're exploring strategic alternatives for our position. Wondered if you might be interested in a conversation. Coffee tomorrow. Strategic alternatives. Finance speak for help us get our money back. Bridge Capital was about to foreclose on Vantage Arc, and they needed someone who understood the underlying assets. I'm available at 10, I said, but I should disclose I may have my own interest in those assets. A pause. Even better. We prefer dealing with principals who know the space. Cafe Sora on 17th. After he hung up, I sat surrounded by contracts and calculations. 6 years of keeping Northbridge compliant, making sure every agreement was bulletproof, every risk documented and mitigated. Gavin had shredded my severance, thinking he was cutting me loose. Instead, he'd cut my last tie to playing by corporate rules. I pulled up the Heliosynth patent portfolio one more time. 3 patents, 512 claims between them. Every single Northbridge product infringed at least 40 of those claims, without a valid license. Each unit shipped was willful infringement, treble damages plus attorney's fees. The numbers were beautiful in their simplicity. Vantage Arc's distressed debt, $2.8 million. Potential recovery from Northbridge, $48 to $60 million. Depending on how aggressive I wanted to be. More than enough to make Bridge Capital whole, fund the acquisition, and still have 40 million reasons for Gavin Slate to regret that afternoon's performance with the scissors. I locked the storage unit at 1:15 a.m. Contracts safely returned to their fireproof homes. Tomorrow, I'd incorporate Heartline Holdings. Then I'd make Bradley Chen an offer he couldn't refuse. After that, Northbridge would learn what happened when you treated your infrastructure as disposable. The fragment of my shredded severance agreement was still in my pocket. I pulled it out one last time. Release and set. Mutual. By the time I was done, Gavin would understand that some releases only flowed one way. Cafe Sora occupied the ground floor of a building I'd once considered leasing for Northbridge's satellite office. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked in at 9:58 a.m. Bradley Tanaka from Bridge Capital was already there, nursing an espresso and studying his laptop screen with the intensity of someone watching their investment circle the drain. Ms. Hart, he stood, extending a hand. Thank you for meeting on short notice. Bradley looked exactly like every distressed debt investor I'd ever met. Brooks Brothers' suit slightly rumpled, bags under his eyes that suggested too many late nights modeling recovery scenarios, and that particular combination of desperation and predatory hope that came from chasing good money after bad. Let's skip the pleasantries, I said, settling into the leather chair across from him. Vantage Arc owes you $2.8 million. They've missed one interest payment, about to miss the second. You're looking at a foreclosure that might net you the office furniture and some questionable IP rights. How warm am I? His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. You've done your homework. I wrote the original license agreements. I know exactly what Vantage Arc owns and what they don't. Bradley pulled out a folder stamped confidential in red. Inside, the loan documentation I'd already seen in public filings, plus Vantage Arc's internal financials. Worse than I'd estimated, they were burning through $40,000 a month just to keep the lights on, with revenue declining as Northbridge systematically underreported their royalty base. What Bridge Capital needs, Bradley said carefully, is someone who understands the asset value and can maximize recovery. Traditional foreclosure gets us maybe 30 cents on the dollar. But if someone were to cure the default, assume the note. You'd get par plus accrued interest, I finished, about 2.95 million all in. Hypothetically, yes, of course. Any buyer would need to demonstrate capability to manage the assets post-acquisition. I smiled, the same cold smile I'd perfected during vendor negotiations. Mr. Tanaka, I don't just understand these assets. I know every licensee, every revenue stream, every violation currently being papered over. More importantly, I know exactly how much Northbridge has been shorting Vantage Arc on royalties. His eyes sharpened. How much? Conservatively, 12 million in underreported revenue, with penalties and interest under the audit provisions. Call it 24 million. That's before we discuss the sublicense to Meridian Instruments that violates the field of use restrictions, or the escrow release conditions that Northbridge technically triggered 6 months ago. Bradley set down his cup very carefully. You're suggesting Vantage Arc has been leaving money on the table. I'm suggesting Marcus Webb is a brilliant engineer who couldn't collect a dinner check, let alone enforce a 9-figure patent portfolio. Bridge Capital backed the wrong horse, but the race isn't over. We spent the next hour going through the numbers. I showed him the shadow royalty calculations, the audit trail I'd maintained, the smoking guns buried in Northbridge's own SEC filings, every underpayment, every contractual violation, every piece of leverage that Vantage Arc had failed to pull. There's one problem, Bradley said finally. The ROFR provision in side letter 3. If we bring in a buyer, Vantage Arc has to offer the assets to existing licensees first. I pulled out my phone, showed him the corporate formation documents I'd filed that morning. Heartline Holdings, LLC, formed specifically for this transaction. By Monday, I'll have a signed letter of intent from Heartline to acquire Vantage Arc's assets for $3.1 million. That triggers the ROFR notice to Northbridge and the other licensees. They'll match any offer to protect their license. No, I said, they won't, because Gavin Slate thinks vendor management is beneath him. He'll see the notice, assume it's a formality, maybe forward it to legal for review. By the time Mason Dwyer explains the implications, the response window will have closed. Bradley studied me over his laptop screen. You seem very confident about Northbridge's response time. I implemented their contract management system. I know exactly how long it takes for critical notices to filter up through the approval chain. More importantly, I know Gavin's traveling to Boston next week for investor meetings. He'll be distracted. And if they do respond, then Heartline walks with a breakup fee. Bridge Capital gets paid either way, and I find another angle, but they won't respond. Trust me. We negotiated for another 2 hours. Bridge Capital would sell the note to Heartline for full payoff, $2.95 million contingent on Heartline raising the funds within 10 business days. In exchange, I got step-in rights as secured creditor, including the ability to credit bid in any foreclosure and immediate assignment of all information rights under the loan documents. One more thing, I said as Bradley packed up his files. I'll need Bridge Capital to issue the default notice today. Formal notification to Vantage Arc that they're in breach, with 10 days to cure. That's aggressive. Usually we try to work with borrowers. Marcus Webb has had 6 months to work with you. He's too proud to admit he's drowning and too stubborn to take on a partner. The only way this works is if we force the issue. Bradley hesitated, then nodded. I'll have our lawyers draft it this afternoon. After he left, I sat in the cafe, watching the afternoon crowd of tech workers grabbing overpriced salads. Half of them probably worked at companies that depended on licensed IP they didn't understand. Infrastructure invisible until it failed. My phone buzzed. Ruth Delgado, the M&A advisor I'd worked with on Northbridge's last acquisition. Elena, heard you're raising $3 million for a distressed asset play. Need help structuring. The Denver tech finance scene was smaller than people realized. Potentially. Can you connect me with Elliot Crane at Elevation Partners? The IP roll-up guy, sure. But he's expensive money. Takes a big piece of anything he touches. He also closes in days, not weeks, and he hates Gavin Slate. Ruth laughed. The Meridian Instruments deal. Gavin backed out after Elliot had spent $200,000 on diligence. Yeah, he'd probably fund your grocery list if it meant sticking it to Northbridge. By 4:30 p.m., I had meetings scheduled with 3 potential funding sources. The default notice would hit VantageArc by close of business. Marcus Webb would panic, call his lawyer, discover he had no options. The foreclosure clock would start ticking. I drove past Northbridge's building on my way home. The executive floor lights were still on Gavin's corner office, blazing against the darkening sky. He was probably in there calculating his Series D valuation, planning his victory lap. In 10 days, VantageArc would default completely. In 15 days, Heartline Holdings would own their entire patent license portfolio. In 20 days, Northbridge would receive an audit notice that would make their CFO weep. The fragment of my severance papers tucked in my pocket had turned into a charm. Each brush against it brought back the hiss of the scissors, the effortless malice in their motion. Gavin believed he was freeing himself from me. In truth, he was severing his own rope, slice by deliberate slice. The lights in his office finally went dark at 9:47 p.m. Late night for a CEO who usually left by 6 for his Tesla drive home to Cherry Hills. Series D stress. Probably. He had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The law offices of Delgado and Associates occupied a converted Victorian in Capitol Hill, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood that screamed boutique M&A firm. Ruth had built her practice on the corpses of failed tech deals, and her conference room walls displayed the tombstones of transactions like hunting trophies. Heartline Holdings needs to be bulletproof, I told her at 7:30 a.m., sliding the operating agreement across her desk. Single member LLC, Delaware formation, all the standard poison pills. Ruth scanned the documents with practiced eyes. Elevation Partners as lead investor, Elliott's terms are going to be brutal. 25% carry on any returns over 3x, board observation rights, and a liquidation preference that would make a venture capitalist blush. I confirmed. But he funds in 72 hours and doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about motivation. Speaking of motivation, Ruth pulled out her iPad. Marcus Webb's been calling my office. Seems Bridge Capital's default notice has him exploring options. I'd expected this. Marcus was brilliant but predictable faced with catastrophic loss. He'd thrash around looking for any lifeline. What's he offering? Wants to bring in a strategic partner, maintain some upside. He's shopping a deck showing $100 million valuations based on untapped licensing potential. The same potential he's failed to tap for 3 years. Ruth shrugged. Desperate founders tell themselves beautiful lies. The question is whether he can find a buyer who believes them. He can't, I said. Not in 10 days, not with $2.8 million in secured debt and Bridge breathing down his neck. Every strategic will take one look at the financials and run. Every financial buyer will see the hair on the deal except Elliott, who sees the chance to flip licenses to Red Canyon Instruments. Red Canyon's looking to enter biosensors. They've been sniffing around for 2 years. Gavin blocked them from acquiring Meridian Instruments, so they're hungry for a way in. The VantageArc portfolio would give them immediate patent coverage, plus the ability to squeeze Northbridge on renewal terms. Ruth made notes on her tablet. Elliott fronts $3 million to take out Bridge. You control VantageArc, audit Northbridge into submission, then flip the portfolio to Red Canyon for $20 million. $40 million, I corrected. After we collect the $24 million in underreported royalties and penalties. Jesus, Ruth set down her iPad. Gavin really pissed you off. I touched the shred of severance agreement in my pocket. He taught me that contracts are just paper until someone decides to enforce them. I'm just applying the lesson. By noon, the structure was set. Heartline Holdings would issue membership units to Elevation Partners in exchange for $3 million in funding. The funds would flow to an escrow account at First Republic, with irrevocable instructions to wire to Bridge Capital upon satisfaction of 2 conditions: VantageArc's failure to cure the default, and expiration of the ROFR notice period. The UCC-1 filing is critical. I told Ruth's paralegal, we need to perfect our security interest in all of VantageArc's assets. including the license agreements and rights to audit and enforce. Already drafted, she said, showing me the forms. Filing in Delaware and Colorado. We'll have file-stamped copies back by close of business. Elliot Crane arrived at 2:15 p.m., looking like he'd stepped out of a Patagonia catalog fleece vest over plaid shirt. Tesla key fob spinning between his fingers. The aesthetic was carefully calculated to project approachable billionaire, but I'd seen him eviscerate CEOs in board meetings. Elena, he settled into Ruth's conference room chair like a predator claiming territory. Ruth says you're buying Gavin Slate's oxygen supply. The patent licenses that enable 80% of his revenue, I confirmed. Want to see the numbers? I want to see the kill shot. Numbers are foreplay, show me how he bleeds out. I walked him through the enforcement mechanism, the audit rights that would expose $12 million in underreported royalties, the cure provisions that would cost Northbridge another $12 million in penalties, the escrow release conditions that would freeze their production line until payments cleared. Best case, Gavin writes a check for $24 million and renegotiates license terms at triple the current rate. I explained. Worst case, we terminate for breach and license Red Canyon instead. Either way, Elevation clears minimum 3x returns in under 6 months. Elliot studied the flow chart I'd prepared. Each box represented a contractual trigger, each arrow a required notice or payment. The beautiful machinery of commercial destruction, documented in PowerPoint. What about the ROFR? He asked. Gavin's not stupid. He'll match any offer to protect his supply chain. He's not stupid, I agreed. But he is arrogant, and he's about to be distracted. Series D Roadshow starts Monday. He'll be in Boston, then New York, then San Francisco. 14-hour days pitching investors on Northbridge's unstoppable growth story, while his ops team handles vendor notices. His interim ops team, I corrected, the one he hasn't hired yet because he assumed my responsibilities would be easily distributed. The notice will land in legal's inbox, get flagged for review, sit in Mason Dwyer's queue while he bills hours on the Series D. By the time Gavin realizes what's happening, the 10-day ROFR period expires. We own Vantage Arc free and clear. Elliot spun his key fob one more time, then set it on the table. I'm in. One condition: I want a face-to-face with Gavin when this goes down. I want to see his expression when he realizes his entire product line depends on my signature. Get in line, I said. The funding documents took 4 hours to negotiate. Elliot's lawyers were thorough, inserting reps and warranties that would make me personally liable if the deal cratered. I signed them all. I'd reviewed every contract in Vantage Arc's portfolio. I knew exactly what we were buying. By 6:45 p.m., $3 million sat in escrow, waiting for the dominoes to fall. Bridge Capital had confirmed Vantage. Arc received the default notice. Marcus Webb had retained emergency counsel, but his options were binary: cure the default with money he didn't have, or watch his company disappear into foreclosure. I drove home through downtown Denver, past the towers where all the major firms kept their Colorado offices. Wilson Sonsini, Cooley, Fenwick, any of them would happily bill Northbridge $500,000 to fight what was coming. But first, Gavin would have to realize he was under attack. My phone rang as I pulled into my garage. Marcus Webb, caller ID showing his personal cell. Elena, I heard you left Northbridge. I'm sorry, I always respected how you handled our agreements. Thank you, Marcus. I kept my voice neutral. In another timeline, I might have felt guilty about what was happening to him, but he'd had 3 years to monetize his assets properly. His failure was my opportunity. Listen, I'm in a situation with Bridge Capital. Wondering if you might have any advice. You always understood the licensing landscape better than anyone. I'm not in a position to advise Vantage Arc, I said carefully. You should focus on your counsel's recommendations. A pause. Right, of course. It's just Bridge is being unreasonable. 10 days to cure. That's impossible. That's standard for secured debt. Marcus, you signed those terms 18 months ago. I know. I just thought... His voice trailed off. If someone wanted to acquire our portfolio, What would you think it's worth? In this market with clean title and no debt, I pretended to consider. Maybe 15 to 20 million to the right strategic, but that's not your situation. No, he said quietly. It's not. After we hung up, I sat in my garage, engine cooling in the darkness. Marcus Webb was about to lose everything he'd built: his reputation, his company, his carefully cultivated patent portfolio, collateral damage in my war against Gavin Slate. I pulled out the shred of severance agreement. In the dome light, I could just make out the faded ink. Dual release and set it. Mutual. In 5 days, Marcus would lose Vantage Arc. In 15 days, Gavin would understand that some releases only flowed one way, and somewhere between those 2 points, I'd transform from the woman who kept the lights on to the one who controlled the switch. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 3 p.m. at the Denver County Courthouse, but the real action happened in Ruth's conference room at 1:30. Marcus Webb sat across from me, looking like he hadn't slept since receiving the default notice 10 days ago. His lawyer, a nervous junior partner from a mid-tier firm, kept checking his phone like salvation might arrive via email. "This doesn't have to happen," Marcus said for the 3rd time. "If I just had another 30 days. "Bridge Capital owns your debt," I interrupted. "They've assigned their rights to Heartline Holdings. The notice period has expired. Your options are to accept our offer or watch the assets go to public auction." Ruth slid the purchase agreement across the table. "Mr. Webb, this is actually generous. Heartline's offering to assume the debt and pay you $50,000 for a clean transition. That's $50,000 more than you'll get in foreclosure." Marcus's hands shook as he picked up the document. 3 years of his life reduced to boilerplate asset transfer language. I knew the feeling watching your work disappear into someone else's portfolio. The difference was, Marcus had failed to protect his creation. I was about to weaponize mine. "The IP assignments," his lawyer finally spoke up. "They seem overly broad. You're taking not just the patent licenses but all related rights, including audit and enforcement." "That's the entire value of the portfolio," I said. "Without enforcement rights, the licenses are just paper." "Paper that generates $2 million in annual royalties," Marcus added desperately. "Surely that's worth more than $50,000. "It generates $2 million because Northbridge underreports by 80%. I cut him off. "The real royalty stream should be $10 million annually, but you never enforced the audit provisions, never challenged their allocations, never pressed on the field of use violations." Marcus flinched. He knew I was right. Every quarterly royalty report from Northbridge had been a masterclass in creative accounting, and he'd accepted them all without question. "How do you know about the underreporting?" his lawyer asked. I smiled. "Because I designed Northbridge's revenue recognition system. I know exactly how they hide biosensor sales in software bundles. More importantly, I know how to prove it." The room went quiet, except for the hum of Ruth's printer spitting out signature pages. Marcus stared at the wall of deal tombstones, probably wondering if Vantage Arc would merit a plaque. Failed patents licensing play, killed by its own founder's negligence. "If I sign," Marcus said finally, "what happens to Northbridge?" "That depends on Gavin Slate's appetite for writing large checks. He'll fight. He doesn't like being cornered. Then he'll learn what happens when you treat your infrastructure as disposable." Marcus signed at 2:47 p.m. Each signature transferred another piece of Vantage Arc to Heartline Holdings: the patent licenses, the audit rights, the precious enforcement provisions that would let me reach into Northbridge's revenue stream and extract $24 million in blood money. His lawyer gathered the executed documents with the efficiency of someone who'd just witnessed an execution. "We'll need copies of all licensee correspondence and royalty reports." "Already prepared," I said, gesturing to the banker's boxes stacked in the corner. 3 years of records, indexed and cross-referenced. Your client maintained excellent files. "Just not excellent enforcement," Marcus muttered. After they left, Ruth poured 2 glasses of the expensive scotch she kept for closed deals. "That was cold, even for you." He had 3 years to monetize those patents properly. I have 3 months before Red Canyon's acquisition window closes. And Gavin, when does he find out his new landlord is evicting him? I checked my phone. 4:53 p.m. in Denver meant 6:53 in Boston. Gavin would be at dinner with investors, probably at Grill 23 ordering the Wagyu and explaining Northbridge's revolutionary approach to biosensor technology. Mason Dwyer would be back in Denver, billing hours on Series D documentation, inbox full of unread vendor notices. The ROFR notice went to legal at noon, certified mail, email, and courier service to ensure delivery. Mason has until close of business Monday to respond. He won't even see it until Monday morning. And by then, it'll be buried under 100 Series D emails. He might flag it for Gavin's attention, but the roadshow doesn't wrap until Friday. Best case, they catch it Tuesday, realize Wednesday, panic Thursday. By which time, the ROFR period expires and Heartline owns Vantage Arc free and clear. We clinked glasses. The scotch burned expensive and smooth, like justice served at exactly the right temperature. Elliot called at 7 p.m., voice crackling over his Tesla's Bluetooth. Escrow released the funds. Bridge Capital confirms receipt. We officially own $3 million of angry paper. Valuable angry paper, I corrected. Did you reach out to Red Canyon? Had drinks with their CEO this afternoon. Showed him the patent portfolio, the Northbridge underreporting analysis, the field of use violations. He nearly choked on his martini when he saw the numbers. Interested. 40 million interested. Contingent on clean title post-enforcement. He wants Gavin's scalp as much as you do. Get in line, I said again. I spent the evening in my storage unit, pulling files that would soon see daylight. The audit trail I'd maintained, the violation notices I'd drafted but never sent, the smoking guns I'd preserved in triplicate. Each folder represented a different angle of attack, a different way to make Northbridge bleed. The royalty underreporting was the obvious play. 12 million in unreported revenue, another 12 in penalties. But the real leverage was in the technical violations. Section 8.4c. Northbridge had modified the calibration algorithms without licensor approval. Section 11.2. They'd shared confidential specifications with an unauthorized third party. Section 14.7. They'd failed to maintain required insurance naming Vantage Arc as additional insured. Any one violation was enough to trigger termination. Together, they formed a symphony of contractual breaches that would give Gavin Slate nightmares for years. My phone buzzed at 11:30 p.m. Text from an unknown number. Heard you bought Vantage Arc. Impressive. Coffee tomorrow. KP. Kayla Pierce, HR director who'd watched Gavin shred my severance and done nothing, probably feeling guilty or worried about her own position. I deleted the text without responding. Some bridges were meant to stay burned. Another text, this one from Bradley at Bridge Capital. Wire received. Pleasure doing business. Good hunting. Good hunting, like he knew exactly what I planned to do with my newly acquired arsenal. Like the entire Denver finance community was watching to see how the woman who kept the lights on would handle the switch. I locked the storage unit and drove home through empty Denver streets. Somewhere in Boston. Gavin was sleeping in a Four Seasons bed, dreaming of Series D valuations and IPO roadshows. He had no idea that his patent licenses now belonged to someone who knew every line of code in his products, every component in his supply chain, every vulnerability in his contracts. The shred of severance agreement sat on my dashboard, a reminder of Tuesday's humiliation. To all release and set. In 5 days. The ROFR would expire. In 6 days. I'd send the first audit notice. In 7 days. Gavin Slate would understand that some contracts were written in blood, not ink. And they all came due eventually. The notice of audit hit Northbridge's legal department at 9:05 a.m. on Monday, exactly 1 business hour after the ROFR period expired. I knew because Mason Dwyer called Ruth's office at 9:17, voice pitched somewhere between confusion and panic. "This has to be a mistake," he said over speakerphone. VantageArc can't assign audit rights without consent. Check Section 16.3, I said calmly. Assignment permitted to any entity acquiring substantially all assets. Heartline Holdings closed on Friday. Elena. His voice cracked. What are you? How are you? Counsel for Heartline Holdings and successor in interest to all VantageArc licensing rights. Will need 12 months of revenue records by close of business Wednesday. The notice specifies the format. Gavin's in San Francisco. He doesn't even know. Then you better call him. The cure period is 10 calendar days, not business days. Clock's ticking. Ruth muted the call while Mason sputtered about unreasonable timeframes. You enjoyed that. 6 years of his condescending emails about unnecessary contract complexity. He's about to learn why every clause mattered. When we unmuted, Mason had found his lawyer voice. We'll need to review this claim with our client. Any audit is subject to reasonable scheduling and scope limitations. Section 4B specifies no limitations on first audit, I recited from memory. Licensee bears all costs if underreporting exceeds 5%. Based on our preliminary analysis, you're at 80%. That's ridiculous. Biosensor revenue allocated to software services, patent practicing components bundled with unrelated products, sales to Meridian International booked as engineering samples to avoid royalties. Should I continue? Silence. Then we'll get back to you. The notice of material breach went out 2 hours later. A beautiful 12-page document that Ruth's associates had crafted like a surgical instrument. Each violation meticulously documented, cross-referenced to specific contract sections, supported by public filings and the treasure trove of emails I'd preserved. The SLA violation was my personal favorite. Northbridge had been using a workaround for digital signature validation, claiming it was a temporary measure while they fixed a bug. That was 18 months ago. The workaround bypassed VantageArc's validation servers, technically making every signed firmware update legally questionable. You realize this could crater their FDA clearances, Ruth pointed out, reviewing the notice. If their signatures aren't valid, then every device update for the past year violated federal regulations. I finished. Gavin should have fixed it when I flagged it. Instead, he called it operational overhead and told me to focus on revenue-generating activities. By 3 p.m., my phone was lighting up with calls from Northbridge numbers. I let them all go to voicemail, maintaining the professional distance that Gavin had taught me. Everything through counsel, everything in writing, everything building toward the inevitable conclusion. Elliot arrived at 4, looking gleeful. Red Canyon's board approved the $40 million acquisition, contingent on either collecting the audit penalties or terminating Northbridge's license. They're already drafting press releases about entering the biosensor market. Premature, I said. Gavin will fight. He has to without these patents. Northbridge is just a software company with delusions of grandeur. Let him fight. Every day costs him more. Speaking of which, Elliot pulled out his tablet. Want to see something beautiful? He showed me Northbridge's investor deck for the Series D. Slide 23. Proprietary biosensor technology protected by exclusive patent portfolio. Slide 41. 90% gross margins enabled by efficient IP licensing structure. They're raising at a $400 million valuation, Elliot continued. Based entirely on products that depend on your licenses. What happens when investors find out their IP strategy is built on sand? They run, Ruth answered. Fast? The first reporter called at 5:43 p.m. Someone had leaked the audit notice, probably a paralegal at Mason's firm looking to curry favor with the press. I declined comment, but the damage was done. By 6, the Denver Business Journal had posted a story. Northbridge Dynamics faces patent licensing dispute ahead of major funding round. Gavin called personally at 7:22 p.m. I recognized the number his personal cell, the one he used for important negotiations. I let it ring through to voicemail, then played the message on speaker for Ruth and Elliot. Elena, this is beneath you. His voice carried that forced calm he used when truly furious. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, We can discuss it like professionals. Call me. Notice how he doesn't deny the underreporting, Ruth observed. Or apologize for shredding my severance, I added. The real escalation came at 9 p.m. Notice of escrow release request, demanding immediate access to the source code and signing keys held by the third-party escrow agent. VantageArc's rights under a security provision I'd insisted on 3 years ago, when Northbridge had missed 2 quarterly payments during a cash crunch. The escrow agent has 5 business days to validate the request, I explained to Elliot. Northbridge can object, but they have to show why the triggering conditions weren't met. Which they can't, because you documented everything. Because I documented everything. I agreed. My phone rang again, Mason Dwyer, probably calling from his car based on the background noise. Elena, be reasonable. You know this escrow release will shut down their production line. No signing keys means no firmware updates, means no shipments to customers. Then Northbridge should cure the defaults, I said. Pay the underreported royalties, fix the SLA violations, unwind the unauthorized sublicense, or negotiate a settlement that reflects the actual value of what they've taken. They can't pay $24 million in 10 days. No company keeps that kind of cash liquid. They're raising a $100 million Series D at a $400 million valuation. I'm sure their investors would be happy to bridge the financing. Not if it means admitting they've been systematically underreporting revenue. The SEC implications alone are Gavin's problem, not mine. Mason's voice dropped. This isn't who you are, Elena. You were always the reasonable one, the one who found solutions, not created problems. I was the one who kept the lights on, I said. Until Gavin decided I was disposable overhead, now I'm the one who controls the switch. After I hung up, the 3 of us sat in Ruth's conference room, watching the Denver skyline darken. Somewhere out there, Northbridge's leadership team was probably gathered in emergency session, trying to figure out how their carefully maintained vendor had suddenly grown teeth. What's the next move? Elliot asked. We wait, I said. Gavin has 9 days to cure the defaults. He'll spend 3 days consulting lawyers, 2 days modeling scenarios, 2 days trying to find loopholes, 1 day panicking, and 1 day calling to negotiate. And if he doesn't? I touched the shred of severance agreement in my pocket. Then at 12:01 a.m. on day 11, every Northbridge product becomes an infringing device. Treble damages for willful infringement, plus attorney's fees. The company he built on our patents becomes a $40 million liability. Ruth poured another round of scotch. To infrastructure, she toasted. To contracts written in blood, Elliot added. To mutual releases, I finished. That only flow one way. The chess match accelerated on day 3 when Red Canyon Instruments made their move public. Their CEO, David Park, had waited 2 years for revenge after Gavin torpedoed the Meridian acquisition. Now he smelled blood in the water. Strategic partnership announcement. Read the press release that hit the wire at 6 a.m. Red Canyon Instruments enters exclusive negotiations for biosensor patent portfolio, positioning for major market expansion. My phone exploded with calls. I was reviewing the escrow agent's preliminary validation report when Ruth burst into my home office at 7:15. Red Canyon leaked the term sheet, she said, tablet in hand. $18 million up front, 7.5% running royalty, exclusive rights in Northbridge's core markets. David always did like public pressure. I pulled up Northbridge's stock price, down 12% in pre-market trading. How long before the Series D investors notice? Based on the panic in Mason's voicemail, they already have. The escrow agent's report was damning in its bureaucratic precision. 300 pages documenting every technical dependency between Northbridge's products and the licensed patents. The signature validation system alone touched 42 different modules, without access to the keys. Northbridge couldn't push a single update to their installed base. Best part, I showed Ruth page 187. They hard-coded dependencies on VantageArc's validation servers. Even if they wanted to switch, it would take 6 months of engineering. Because you designed it that way. Because I insisted on proper security architecture. The fact that it creates vendor lock-in was just fortuitous. Gavin's first real countermove came at 2 p.m., a formal response to the audit notice. 40 pages of legal gymnastics arguing that software service revenue was exempt from royalty calculations. Mason had clearly pulled an all-nighter, citing cases about mixed products and allocation methodologies. Impressive, Ruth admitted, reading their brief. Wrong, but impressive. Check footnote 23, I said. They cite the 2019 Revenue Recognition Memo, the one I wrote explaining why we needed to segregate biosensor revenue. They're literally using my own documentation against me. Except you wrote that memo to prevent exactly this kind of gaming, which I explained in the email thread Mason conveniently didn't attach, the one where Gavin overruled my recommendation and told me to focus on closing deals, not creating bureaucracy. I pulled up the email thread, forwarded it to Ruth with the subject line, Exhibit A, Willful Circumvention of Royalty Obligations. The Denver tech community was small enough that gossip traveled at light speed. By evening, 3 different reporters had called for comment. The narrative was writing itself local unicorns' valuation in jeopardy over IP disputes. Former executive turned patent licensor. David versus Goliath with a role reversal. You need to control this story, Ruth advised, before Gavin spins it as a disgruntled employee situation. Let him try. Discovery would be fascinating. At 9 p.m., the next shoe dropped. Northbridge filed an emergency motion in Delaware Chancery Court, seeking to enjoin the escrow release. Their argument irreparable harm to ongoing operations, balance of equities, the usual injunction standards. They'd forum shopped well. Delaware judges understood the importance of keeping businesses running. They'll get a TRO, Elliott said over conference call. 10-day restraining order while the court considers the merits, buys them time. Time to do what the audit deadline doesn't change. Neither does the cure period for the breaches. Time to negotiate. Speaking of which, Elliott's voice carried that shark-like satisfaction I'd come to recognize. Red Canyon wants to accelerate. They're willing to fund the litigation if it means locking down the patents faster. How much? Blank check for legal fees, plus a bonus kicker 20% premium on the acquisition price if we can deliver clean title within 30 days. $48 million instead of $40. Red Canyon wanted Gavin's market share that badly. Set up the funding agreement, I decided. We're going to need heavy artillery for this fight. The TRO came through at 11:43 p.m., Delaware time, 10 days to brief the escrow issue, another week for oral arguments. The judge's order was careful to note this addressed only the emergency request. The underlying breach claims remained active. Mason called at midnight, trying to sound conciliatory. The TRO gives us breathing room. Maybe we should use it productively. Sure, wire $24 million in audit penalties, and we'll talk about go-forward royalty rates. Elena, you know that's not reasonable. Neither was shredding my severance, but here we are. Gavin wants to meet, face-to-face, tomorrow morning. Gavin can communicate through counsel like any other breaching licensee. He'll be at Ruth's office at 10 a.m., with or without you there. After he hung up, I sat in my dark office, looking at the wall of contracts I'd built over the past 2 weeks. Each document a weapon, each provision a bullet. The audit notice had drawn first blood. The breach notice had opened the arteries. The escrow request was aimed at the heart. But Gavin was finally taking this seriously, flying back from San Francisco, clearing his calendar, showing up in person. He understood now that this wasn't a negotiation, it was an execution. The only question was whether he'd accept the blindfold or go down swinging. My phone buzzed with a text from David Park. Dinner tomorrow after your meeting with Slate, would love to discuss transition planning. Transition planning, like Northbridge was already a corpse and we were just dividing the organs. David had waited 2 years for this moment. I'd waited 2 weeks. Time moved differently when you held the knife. I pulled out the shred of severance agreement, smoothed it on my desk. Under the lamplight, I could see Gavin's fingerprints in the paper, smudged from the scissors. He'd enjoyed that moment of destruction. the theatrical demonstration of power. Tomorrow he'd learn that some performances have encores. The audit deadline was Wednesday. The cure period ended next Monday. Delaware arguments the Monday after that. 3 different timelines converging on a single point the moment Gavin Slate understood that infrastructure wasn't overhead. It was architecture, and I'd designed it all. Ruth's conference room had been transformed into a war room. Bankers' boxes of audit documentation lined one wall. 3 laptops displayed revenue analyses, contract provisions, and a running calculation of damages that ticked upward every time we found another unreported transaction. The number had crossed 30 million at 9:47 a.m. "He's late," Elliot observed, checking his Rolex. "Power play." "Panic," I corrected. "Mason's probably still explaining why their Delaware TRO doesn't actually solve anything." Gavin arrived at 10:23, flanked by Mason and 2 senior associates from Wilson Sonsini, the big guns from Palo Alto. Kayla Pierce trailed behind, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Gavin wore his deal-closing suit, the charcoal Armani he saved for board meetings and acquisitions. His face showed 3 days without sleep and a lifetime without conscience. "Elena." He took the power position at the head of the table, like this was his conference room, his meeting, his terms. "Let's skip the theatrics. What do you want?" I slid a single sheet across the table. "Cure package terms, option 1. He read it without expression, though Mason flinched at the numbers. 48 million immediate payment for underreported royalties and penalties. 7% go-forward royalty on all biosensor revenue. Public statement acknowledging the contributions of VantageArc's IP to Northbridge's success." "Extortion," Gavin said flatly. "Contract enforcement," I replied. "Your signature is on every one of these agreements." "Option 2, Mason asked. I placed the second sheet with ceremonial precision. Immediate termination of all licenses. Northbridge ceases all use of covered patents. $40 million acquisition by Red Canyon Instruments, who'll be happy to license to your competitors. Gavin's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. "You planned this, the whole thing, from the moment you taught me that contracts were just paper until someone decided to enforce them. Your words, Gavin, that Tuesday afternoon in your glass conference room. The Wilson Sonsini senior partner Mitchell something, I'd seen his name on billion-dollar deals, cleared his throat. Ms. Hart, surely there's a middle ground. Northbridge is about to close significant funding that would benefit all stakeholders." "All stakeholders except the ones Gavin disposed of," Elliot interjected. "Funny how that works." "The audit findings," Mitchell continued smoothly, "are subject to interpretation. Software revenue allocation is a complex area." "Page 73, I interrupted, sliding a bound report across the table. Email from Gavin to the CFO. Quote, "Allocate as much as possible to services to minimize royalty burden. Elena will complain, but she works for us, not the licensors." Silence. Even Mitchell looked uncomfortable. "Page 91, I continued. "Meridian sublicence structured specifically to avoid field of use restrictions. Page 120, the SLA workaround that makes every firmware signature legally invalid. Should I continue?" Gavin found his voice. "You documented everything." "Infrastructure and compliance. That was my job. You just never thought I'd use it." "This is personal," he accused. "You're destroying a company over hurt feelings." "No," I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "I'm collecting what's owed, with interest, compound interest, calculated daily, as specified in Section 12.7. Mason tried diplomacy. "The Series D investors are nervous. If this becomes public—" "When," Ruth corrected, "when this becomes public, discovery is a beautiful thing." "You'll destroy the value for everyone," Gavin said. "Employees, investors, customers who depend on our products. The way you destroyed my severance clean cuts, no mercy." I touched the paper fragment in my pocket. "At least I'm offering you options. That's more than you gave me." Kayla finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "The board's meeting at 2 p.m. They need something to tell investors. Tell them the truth, I suggested. Their CEO built an empire on IP he didn't control, revenue he didn't report, and contracts he didn't honor. The infrastructure just caught up with him. Mitchell gathered himself for another run. Ms. Hart, you were a valued member of the Northbridge team. Surely we can structure something that recognizes your contributions without destroying the company you helped build. I didn't help build it, I said. I built the foundation, the contracts, the compliance systems, the vendor relationships that made everything possible. Then Gavin decided the foundation was disposable overhead. $48 million is impossible in this time frame, Mason said desperately. Even if we wanted to pay. Red Canyon's term sheet requires an answer by Friday, Elliot noted. Tick-tock. Gavin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over. We'll fight the audit findings, challenge the breach claims, tie this up in litigation for years. You'll try, I agreed. While your escrow releases remain frozen, your signatures invalid, your production lines silent. How long before customers jump ship? How many days before the Series D lead walks away? The TRO expires in 9 days. The Delaware court might extend it. Might not. Want to bet your company on Delaware Chancery's mood? He stared at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood. Not just the legal trap, but the psychological one. He'd created me taught me that business was war. Contracts were weapons, and mercy was weakness. Now his student had become his judgment. One modification to option 1, I said. The acknowledgement statement must specifically name the employees you terminated in the last quarter, recognition for their contributions to the IP portfolio. That's petty, Mason protested. That's justice. Petty would be requiring Gavin to sign it personally at a press conference. Don't tempt me, Elliot murmured. The negotiation devolved into logistics, payment terms, escrow arrangements, transition services. The lawyers huddled over language while Gavin sat frozen, watching his empire get carved up with surgical precision. Every term I'd insisted on 3 years ago, every provision he'd called unnecessary complexity, had become a blade in the dissection. At 12:15, they broke for an emergency board call. Gavin paused at the door, turned back to me. Was it worth it destroying something real over wounded pride? I pulled out the shred of severance agreement, placed it on the table between us. You destroyed it first. I'm just collecting the pieces, with interest. He left without another word. Kayla lingered, started to speak, then followed the rest out. Think they'll take option 1, Ruth asked. No choice. Option 2 means instant death. Option 1 just means selling organs to pay for chemo. Elliot laughed. Poetic. What's next? Lunch with David Park. He needs to understand what he's really buying, not just patents, but a complete compliance infrastructure. Every contract, every audit trail, every piece of leverage I built over 6 years. And Gavin. I looked at the fragment of paper on the conference table, the word mutual still barely visible. Gavin's about to learn that some releases only flow one way, and some severances cost more than others. The final confrontation came at 11:51 p.m. on day 10, 9 minutes before the cure period expired. Ruth's office had become a command center, laptops, printers, signature pages ready for execution. The wire transfer confirmation sat on the screen, $48 million pending, waiting for signed settlement documents. Gavin entered alone this time, his usual entourage of lawyers relegated to the parking lot. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 10 days. The Armani was wrinkled, the perfect executive presence reduced to a man watching his life's work evaporate. Mason's in the car with signature authority, he said without preamble. The board approved the wire. $48 million clears at midnight if you execute the cure package. I gestured to the conference table, where the agreements weighted 60 pages of precise legal language documenting his capitulation. Everything's ready, just needs your signature. He picked up the pen, a Mont Blanc, this time his own, not the disposable Bic he'd offered me 2 weeks ago. His hand hovered over the first signature line. I need to know something first, he said. When did you decide to do this? The moment I cut up your severance. Before when exactly did Elena Hart decide to destroy me? I considered lying, spinning some story about wounded pride and sudden inspiration, but he deserved the truth before signing away $48 million. The moment you decided I was overhead, I said. When you looked at 6 years of infrastructure and saw only costs to cut, I knew then you'd eventually destroy yourself. I just accelerated the timeline. By buying Vantage Arc, by enforcing the contracts I wrote, every provision you called unnecessary complexity, every audit right you termed excessive, every penalty clause you wanted softened, they were all there for a reason. He set down the pen. The press release, the acknowledgement. You really need that pound of flesh. I pulled up the draft on my laptop, turned it toward him. Northbridge Dynamics acknowledges the foundational contributions of its operations and compliance team, particularly those employees terminated in the recent restructuring, whose work on intellectual property management and vendor relationships enabled the company's growth. That's it. No mention of you specifically. I was never in this for recognition. Gavin, I was in it for the infrastructure, the systems, the contracts, the architecture that made everything work. You taught me it was just paper. I'm teaching you it was everything. He read the statement again, something shifting in his expression. The employees, the ones we let go. This funds their severances. Every penny they were owed, plus interest. Interest, he repeated, almost laughing. Of course there's interest. The clock showed 11:55. 5 minutes to wire $48 million or lose everything. In the parking lot, Mason was probably refreshing his phone obsessively, waiting for the signature confirmation. You know what the ironic part is? Gavin picked up the pen again. I was right about you being infrastructure. I just didn't understand that infrastructure is what holds everything up. Remove it, and the whole building collapses. He signed the first page, then the second, each signature representing millions in penalties, years of underreported royalties, an admission of systematic contract violations. The pen moved with mechanical precision, like he was signing his own death warrant. The escrow releases, he asked between signatures, will be authorized within 1 hour of payment confirmation. Your production lines can resume Monday morning. And Red Canyon receives a polite decline. The patents stay with Heartline Holdings, licensed to Northbridge under the new terms, 7% royalty, paid quarterly, with audit rights twice annually. You could have taken more, he observed, reaching the acknowledgement page. Red Canyon offered $40 million, plus the premium. Why leave money on the table? Because I don't want to destroy Northbridge, I said. I want to own a piece of every biosensor you'll ever sell. 7% of your success, in perpetuity, infrastructure, permanently embedded in your revenue stream. He signed the acknowledgement, the pen scratching loud in the silent office. 11:58. The board wants to hire you back, he said suddenly. Chief Compliance Officer, double your previous salary, full restoration of benefits. No? Why not? You've proven your point, shown your value. We need someone who understands, someone you can control, someone whose infrastructure you can claim as overhead when convenient. No, Gavin, I'm better as your licensor, arm's length, contractually protected, with audit rights that trigger automatically. 11:59, 1 minute to midnight. One signature line remaining, the general release that would resolve all claims. Lock in the settlement, end the war. That Tuesday, he said quietly, when I cut up your severance, I thought I was demonstrating strength, making a point about who had power. You were... But power isn't about who holds the scissors. It's about who writes the contracts. He signed the final page at 11:59 and 40 seconds, 20 seconds before his empire would have crumbled into patent litigation and willful infringement claims. Mason burst through the door at midnight exactly, phone in hand. Wire confirmed $48 million received in escrow account. Ruth materialized with a champagne bottle Cristal, the kind they served at IPO celebrations. Congratulations, everyone. Heartline Holdings is now Northbridge's largest individual revenue recipient. Gavin stood slowly, straightening his wrinkled suit. The employees who were terminated, make sure they know their severances are funded, full amounts, plus what you called interest. Already arranged, I confirmed. Notification letters go out Monday. He moved toward the door, then turned back. The fragment. The piece of your severance agreement. Do you still have it? I pulled it from my pocket, the paper worn soft from 2 weeks of handling. Tool release and setto. Keep it, he said. Frame it. Put it on the wall of whatever office you build next. A reminder that every piece of paper matters. Even the ones that get shredded. Especially those, they have a way of reassembling themselves, with interest. He left without shaking hands, without the false pleasantries of concluded business. Just a man who'd learned that infrastructure wasn't overhead, it was architecture. And the architect always retained the blueprints. Ruth popped the champagne at 12:07 a.m., the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. To Elena Hart, who kept the lights on, then showed everyone where the switches were. To contracts written in blood, Elliot added, raising his glass, and enforced in gold. I touched the fragment of paper one last time before putting it away. Mutual release and settlement. Gavin had been right about one thing. I would frame it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Some releases only flow one way. Some settlements cost more than others. And some infrastructure is priceless. The Denver Post ran the story 3 days later, buried in the business section where only people like me would notice. Northbridge Dynamics restructures patent licensing. Funds former employee severances. No mention of the midnight wire transfer, the $48 million in penalties, or the CEO who'd learned that scissors couldn't cut through properly drafted contracts. I read it over morning coffee in my new office, a converted loft in Rhino with exposed brick and industrial fixtures. Nothing like Northbridge's glass towers, but it had something better, a clear view of their building in the distance, a daily reminder that I owned 7% of everything happening inside. The first royalty check arrived exactly 30 days later, as specified in Section 6.2 of the Cure Agreement, $3.2 million, representing 1 month of Northbridge's biosensor revenue properly calculated. No bundling games, no service allocation tricks, just clean math, enforced by audit rights that would trigger every 6 months like clockwork. Ruth stopped by that afternoon with incorporation documents for my next venture. Heartline Infrastructure Partners. Has a nice ring to it. What's the business model? She asked, settling into one of my deliberately uncomfortable guest chairs, a small joke about infrastructure that only I appreciated. Distressed IP acquisition. Focus on underleveraged patent portfolios with weak enforcement. Buy the rights. Audit the licensees. Extract proper value. Create more Northbridge situations. Prevent them. Most inventors are like Marcus Webb, brilliant creators. Terrible business people. They license their life's work for pennies while companies like Northbridge make millions. I'll be the infrastructure between innovation and exploitation. My phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number with a bolder area code. Ms. Hart, I have 12 patents in advanced materials, licensed to 3 Fortune 500 companies. Pretty sure they've been underreporting for years. Coffee. That's the 4th one this week, I told Ruth. Word's getting around. The woman who made Gavin Slate pay $48 million, yeah, word gets around. The fragment of my severance agreement sat in a simple black frame on my desk, positioned where every visitor would see it. Some asked about it, most assumed it was modern art, abstract, minimalist, meaningful only to those who knew the story. Both interpretations were correct. Kayla Pierce visited on a Thursday afternoon, looking healthier than she had during those final days at Northbridge. I wanted to thank you, she said without preamble. The severance funding. 6 people got their packages fully paid because of what you did. Because of what Gavin owed, I corrected. I just collected, with interest. Still. She placed a bottle of wine on my desk, Camus, the kind we'd shared after closing the Meridian deal 2 years ago. The press release, the acknowledgement, it mattered. To all of us who built things that got labeled overhead. Infrastructure, I said. We built infrastructure. The difference matters. She smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her since that Tuesday in the glass conference room. Gavin stepped down yesterday. Board's bringing in a new CEO from Seattle, someone who supposedly understands operational excellence. Good luck to them. They'll need it with that patent portfolio. They want to hire you as a consultant, help with the transition. Tell them my rate is 7% of gross revenue. They're already paying it. After Kayla left, I sat in my empty office, watching the sunset behind North Bridge's towers. Somewhere in those buildings, a new CEO was discovering how deeply my infrastructure ran through their operations. Every contract reference, every compliance checkpoint, every audit trigger, all designed with the patience of someone who understood that infrastructure isn't just overhead. It's the skeleton. Remove it, and the body collapses. My computer chimed with an automated notification. Monthly royalty calculation complete. Pending wire transfer approval. $3.4 million this month. They'd had a good quarter. 7% of their success. Flowing to my account like blood through carefully designed vessels. Elliot called as the wire confirmation came through. Red Canyon's CEO wants to know if you're interested in a similar play. They've got a target with weak IP enforcement. Send me the portfolio. I'll review it this weekend. You know, he mused, we could scale this, raise a fund, hire analysts, become the premier distressed IP player. Infrastructure for infrastructure, I said, has potential. Just promise me one thing. When we're running a $100 million fund, don't let anyone call it overhead. I laughed, touching the framed fragment one more time. Don't worry, I keep very good documentation, and I always calculate interest. The office grew dark as evening fell over Denver. In the distance, Northbridge's towers glowed with the light of engineers working late, building products that relied on patents they'd once treated as afterthoughts. Every line of code they wrote, every device they shipped, 7% of it was mine. Not because I'd destroyed them, but because I'd shown them the true cost of infrastructure, the real price of treating foundation as overhead, the compound interest on contracts written in blood, not ink. Gavin had taught me that business was war. Contracts were weapons, and mercy was weakness. He'd been right about everything except the last part. Mercy wasn't weakness, it was infrastructure. The careful architecture of consequences that let your enemies survive, but never forget. I shut down my computer, locked the office, and headed home through the Denver evening. Tomorrow would bring new patents to evaluate, new underreporting to discover, new infrastructure to value properly. But tonight, I'd simply enjoy the satisfaction of a well-designed system functioning exactly as specified. With interest, compound interest, calculated daily, as specified in Section 12.7. Some releases, after all, only flow one way. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and let's connect. Share our thoughts about Elena's journey and what justice means in the corporate world. If you enjoyed this tale of contracts and consequences, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And if you really want to help this story reach more people who appreciate a good revenge tale, hit that hype button. It makes all the difference. Until next time, remember, document everything, calculate interest, and never underestimate the power of good infrastructure.